Julian Thorne was the most infamous libertine in New York City. He watched from his velvet chair as the evening's main attraction, a rising starlet with eyes like emeralds, finished her performance. She glided towards him, her smile a carefully constructed masterpiece. She wondered aloud if a man of his stature might spare a token of his appreciation. Julian toyed with the crystal rim of his champagne flute. For a smile like hers, anything was possible, he mused, telling her to name her price. The starlet's eyes gleamed as she requested the heavy gold signet ring on his finger. His hand went to his pinky, deftly unclasping the ring from among a collection of other, lesser baubles. The Thorne family crest, a stylized falcon set in onyx, seemed to absorb the light of the grand ballroom. He let out a low, amused laugh, asking if she was certain that was her choice. After her breathy confirmation, he held it up, the light catching its polished surface. It was a discerning choice. It was also the ring meant for the future spouse of the Thorne heir, the one who would one day co-helm the family's vast industrial empire. He informed her that if she truly wanted the ring, she'd have to be prepared to accept the responsibilities that came with it. The declaration sent a ripple through the nearby tables. The starlet's face lit up with an ecstatic disbelief, and even the daughters of senators and CEOs, seated at a discreet distance, stirred with envy and frustration. Just as the ring was about to pass from his hand to hers, a young woman in a strikingly vibrant dress hurried forward, cutting through the crowd. She reminded Julian that he still owed her a favor from a past encounter at a charity auction. With a bold look, she declared her intent to claim the prize for herself. Julian sighed, a mask of theatrical disappointment on his face, as he spun the ring between his fingers. He stated that it seemed unfair to choose one over the other. To settle it, he would simply toss it into the air, and fate would decide its owner. The women's eyes widened in anticipation. Without a backward glance, he flung the ring over his shoulder, off the rooftop terrace and into the Manhattan night. It traced a perfect, glittering arc against the city lights. A chaotic scramble ensued as the elegantly dressed women abandoned all decorum, pushing and shoving in a desperate bid to catch the prize. Even the server refilling Julian's glass seemed momentarily distracted, her gaze following the ring's descent as she spilled a few drops of champagne on the tablecloth. Julian chuckled softly and took a sip from his glass. Suddenly, the clamor from below ceased. A profound silence fell over the crowd. He wondered what could have caused such an abrupt halt to the spectacle. With a flicker of curiosity, he leaned over the railing. He saw the ring resting in the palm of a man whose stark, dark suit seemed to carve him out from the glitz of the city. Ethan Cole, the youngest and most formidable U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. As Julian's indifferent gaze fell upon him, Ethan looked up, their eyes meeting across the distance. Ethan's were cold like a winter storm. His austere presence was a stark anomaly in the decadent atmosphere. He held up the ring, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, cool and measured. He asked Julian if he was aware of the charges for reckless endangerment and inciting a public disturbance. Julian and Ethan were the city's most notorious rivals. Since their days at the same Ivy League university, Ethan had been the paragon of discipline and integrity, the golden boy destined for greatness. Julian, in contrast, was always mentioned in the same breath as a cautionary tale, the prodigal son squandering his immense inheritance. Now, with Ethan in a position of power, he frequently made Julian's hedonistic lifestyle a subject of public scrutiny and private investigation. Julian found it all terribly amusing. He wasn't some debutante in need of a pristine reputation. Leaning against the terrace railing, his lips still bearing a faint sheen from his champagne, Julian looked down with an air of theatrical indolence. He told Ethan that if the ring offended him so, he should feel free to give it away. It was, after all, just a trifle for his amusement. Discarded and forgotten. Ethan merely scoffed, turning to leave, but he was immediately surrounded. A young heiress, her face flushed, asked if she could purchase the ring from him for $10,000. Inspired by her boldness, the other women quickly swarmed him, their offers escalating rapidly. 100,000. A million. Julian watched, thoroughly entertained, as the city's most untouchable prosecutor was trapped by a flock of determined socialites. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. He commented on Julian's impressive ability to cause chaos with a single gesture. He scanned the faces of the women around him, his gaze sharp and unforgiving. He reminded them that just 3 months ago, when their fathers were asked to contribute to a federal disaster relief fund, they had all pleaded poverty to his office. Yet now, their daughters were casually offering fortunes for a piece of jewelry. He suggested, with a chilling lack of warmth, that perhaps their fathers should visit his office to explain their sudden and miraculous financial recoveries. The threat hung in the air, instantly silencing the crowd. Julian, sensing the fun was over, gently interrupted. He quipped that such a harsh demeanor would never win a lady's heart. Ethan finally looked up at him, his expression flat. He retorted that the same could be said for Julian. He then added that, if his records were correct, this was the 7th time this month Julian had skipped a board meeting for a social event. Julian felt a flicker of annoyance at how closely Ethan tracked his movements, an uncomfortable feeling akin to guilt. But the thought of appearing before Ethan in any official capacity was unbearable. He could only watch as Ethan pocketed the signet ring, now classified as evidence, and departed. The next day, when Julian was summoned to the White House, a thick briefing binder was thrown at him before he even crossed the threshold of the Oval Office. It wasn't thrown hard enough to injure, but just hard enough to sting. Recognizing his uncle's temper, he entered with a disarmingly apologetic smile. He then noticed Ethan Cole standing silently by the fireplace, and the reason for the president's anger became clear. The president, who was also his maternal uncle, demanded to know if Julian remembered their family connection at all. He raged that while Julian was neglecting his corporate duties, he never missed a party, and now he was causing public scandals that bordered on a marriage proposal. He lamented that Julian had none of the dignity expected of his lineage. Julian moved to pour his uncle a glass of water, a familiar placating gesture. But the president stopped him, telling him not to move. He had already made arrangements for Julian's future. A letter had been sent to Julian's parents, a 4-star general and a former diplomat currently stationed overseas. They were being recalled, and upon their return, Julian would be married to the president's daughter, Amelia. The first daughter was notoriously difficult, known for her volatile temper and cruel treatment of staff. The idea of being shackled to her was a nightmare. Julian immediately dropped to his knees, the various trinkets on his belt clinking against the floor. He thanked the president for the honor but stated he could not accept. Refusing the match was a direct insult to the first family. The president's face darkened as he demanded a reason. Julian's mind raced, his eyes landing on Ethan, who was watching the scene unfold with a detached curiosity. A slow, wicked smile touched Julian's lips. He bowed his head again, his voice ringing with false sincerity. He confessed that it was because he had long been in love with Ethan Cole and was determined to marry him, and him alone. Therefore, he couldn't possibly dishonor the president's daughter. Ethan's composure finally shattered, his expression freezing in disbelief. For a moment, the room was utterly still. Then the president, recovering from his shock, snatched the binder back from an aide and threw it at Julian again. He ordered Julian to go home and stay there to think about the mess he'd made. Julian cheekily remarked that this was precisely why he avoided serious matters. The president, further enraged, threw several more binders in his direction. Julian dodged them nimbly, letting them bounce harmlessly off Ethan. Seeing his chance, he beat a hasty retreat. Ethan was dismissed shortly after. He found Julian waiting in the corridor, his expression seething. He accused Julian of being shameless, of destroying his reputation for a cheap laugh. Julian found it odd. He was ruining his own reputation, he countered, so what did it have to do with Ethan? He mockingly asked if Ethan was worried Julian's scandalous ways would tarnish his pristine image. He added that since Ethan wasn't engaged, no one's feelings would be hurt, except perhaps Julian's own, for being so publicly devoted to an unrequited love. Ethan instinctively retorted that he was engaged. Julian paused, genuinely surprised. He had grown up in these circles. He knew every secret, every affair. He had never heard of Ethan Cole having a fiancée. He studied Ethan's face and guessed it must be a prominent senator's daughter. Ethan denied it, and a shadow of disappointment crossed his features, as if a long-held hope had just been extinguished. Julian didn't notice the subtle shift. He only saw an opportunity. An engagement gave him new leverage. He slung an arm around Ethan's shoulders, a sly grin spreading across his face. He offered to retract his public declaration of love on one condition. Ethan had to call him by a term of endearment. Ethan's face flushed with anger as he asked if Julian was insane. Julian leaned in close, whispering that he was, with a sickness only Ethan could cure. Ethan's cold laugh echoed in the marble hall. He replied that he had thought it might be something less romantic and far more venereal. As Julian was about to retort, a quiet voice interrupted them. Dr. Alistair Finch, the president's enigmatic political analyst, stood nearby. He bowed slightly to them both. He reminded Julian that he had once requested a profile on an important individual. If Julian provided the person's details, he could run the analysis now. Julian, seeing Ethan's stoic and untouchable demeanor, decided to have some more fun. He recited Ethan's birth date and place from memory. He then asked the doctor for his assessment of such a person's destiny. Ethan shot him a look, asking if he had nothing better to do. Dr. Finch considered for a moment, then delivered his verdict. The data suggested a profile with the potential to be a first lady, a queen consort. Julian burst out laughing, looking at Ethan, who was now speechless with rage. He gleefully pointed out that the doctor must be mistaken, as the subject of the profile was a man. Dr. Finch remained unperturbed, merely acknowledging that his models must have been flawed. At that moment, a young aide hurried over, informing Julian that the president's daughter, Amelia, wished to see him. After Julian left, Ethan asked Dr. Finch for his analysis of Julian's profile. The doctor watched Julian's retreating figure and stated that Julian's profile was that of a born disruptor. He described him as listless by day and restless by night, a personality best suited to be a chaotic, unpredictable leader, a tyrant king. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Ethan's eyes before they returned to their usual icy calm. He pointed out that the line of succession was clear and the political dynasty stable. Dr. Finch simply smiled and conceded his error. Julian met Amelia in a private garden. She greeted him warmly, asking if he had spoken with her father. Julian sat down casually, confirming that he had, and that he had been told to get lost. Amelia looked embarrassed. She assured him that her father only had his best interests at heart and then brought up the subject of their marriage. Julian cut her off. He forced himself to repeat the lie, explaining that his flamboyant lifestyle was a cover for his forbidden love for Ethan, and that he was unworthy of her. Amelia's smile faltered for a second before she forced it back, shaking her head as if to deny the absurd idea. She reminded him of their childhood friendship, insisting she knew the real him. She then began to disparage Ethan, calling him a self-righteous fraud and suggesting that no one in politics was truly clean. Something about her words grated on Julian. He politely excused himself, not even bothering with pretenses as he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, her fingernails digging into her palms. Later that night, Julian landed silently on the balcony of Ethan's penthouse. He found Ethan at his desk, engrossed in legal documents. Ethan reacted instantly, a pistol appearing in his hand as he spun around. The sound of Julian's own sidearm clicking against Ethan's weapon echoed in the quiet room. In that split second, Ethan recognized him, his expression shifting from alarm to a complex mix of anger and something else. Julian took advantage of the momentary hesitation, pressing his weapon to Ethan's throat and telling him not to move. His other hand snaked inside Ethan's suit jacket, the brief touch of skin making Ethan's entire body go rigid. Julian's hand moved down his toned torso, finally retrieving the signet ring from an inner pocket. He commented that he was grateful to Ethan for keeping it safe. Seeing the faint blush on Ethan's ears, Julian smirked and stepped back. He polished the ring on his shirt before carefully fastening it back on his finger. Ethan straightened his now rumpled suit, his face once again a cold mask. He didn't say anything, but his brow was furrowed. As Julian turned to leave, Ethan's voice stopped him. He questioned why Julian, with his intelligence and skill, wasted his life on frivolity instead of serving his country. Julian's playful demeanor vanished, replaced by a sudden chill. He turned back, his smile gone. He told Ethan that only someone whose path had been so smooth and celebrated could believe that success was so easily attained for everyone. He then walked out, leaving Ethan standing in stunned silence. He left behind an image of effortless rebellion, but only he knew the bitter truth it concealed. At the White House state dinner, Julian knew Amelia would not let the matter of their engagement rest. He spotted Ethan sitting alone, an island of cold composure in a sea of political maneuvering. Such a handsome man, Julian thought, but utterly devoid of fun. As expected, he saw Amelia approach the president. Thinking fast, Julian strode across the room and slid into the seat next to Ethan, his body pressing against his. Ethan, startled by the sudden proximity, flinched. Julian grabbed the sleeve of his jacket, whispering for him to play along. Ethan glanced at the stage, saw Amelia addressing her father, and understood. He let out a barely audible scoff and raised a glass of water to his lips. But Amelia's voice rang out again, determined. She began to formally request her father's permission to. Julian acted without thinking. He lunged forward, effectively pinning Ethan to his chair. In Ethan's shocked gaze, Julian leaned in and pressed his lips to the rim of the glass Ethan was holding, just as he took a sip. From a distance, it looked like a passionate kiss. The weight of hundreds of stares was palpable, but Julian ignored them. Amelia choked on her words and stormed away, her aides scrambling after her. When the commotion died down, Ethan shot him a look of pure ice. Julian braced himself for a public dressing down. He was ready to double down, to fully commit to the role of the lovelorn pursuer. But to his astonishment, Ethan simply placed his own glass down, took the now empty glass from Julian's table, and drank the water that had just been poured for him. Their hands brushed, their proximity mimicking the intimacy of a shared toast. It was completely out of character. Julian's heart began to pound in his chest, and he retreated to his seat, a strange heat rising in his cheeks. He bumped into a server, who nearly dropped her tray of drinks. Wine splashed all over his suit. The young woman apologized profusely. Julian, frowning at his ruined clothes, asked where he could find a place to change. She directed him to the private spa and pool area reserved for esteemed guests. The water in the heated pool was a soothing balm. He submerged himself, the warm water lapping against his skin. Suddenly, he looked up and met a pair of bloodshot, intense eyes. Ethan was standing at the edge of the pool, smelling faintly of a sweet plum liqueur. His gaze was fixed on Julian, his face flushed with an unnatural heat. Something was wrong. Before Julian could process why the teetotaling Ethan was drunk, his mouth was covered by Ethan's cold lips. The taste of plum and alcohol was overwhelming and insistent. Julian shoved him back. He demanded to know what was wrong with him. Ethan just frowned, as if annoyed by the noise, and pressed his hand over Julian's mouth, his breathing heavy. Julian struggled, kicking out, but Ethan was surprisingly strong. He pinned Julian's arms behind his back against the stone edge of the pool. His hot breath on Julian's neck felt predatory, raising the hairs on his skin. Just then, he heard a voice calling his name from outside the spa. The footsteps grew closer. A look of possessive anger crossed Ethan's face. He tilted his head, thinking for a moment, then shoved Julian's head completely underwater. When the footsteps receded, Ethan pulled him back up, gasping for air. Before Julian could curse him, Ethan lifted him onto the edge of the pool. In the moonlight, he cradled Julian's waist, his fingers tracing his lips. He murmured about how pitiful it was that Julian's lips were now bruised. Julian stared in disbelief as Ethan's eyes grew hazy with intoxication. Did he even know what he was saying? This was not the righteous, controlled man everyone knew. Julian struggled again, but it was useless. Ethan settled himself behind him, his voice a low, husky whisper in his ear. "Be good," he repeated, his voice slurring into something almost unintelligible, like a name. Julian. The next morning, at a press briefing, Ethan was immaculate, his suit perfectly pressed, his posture rigid. He stood so straight that the fabric of his shirt concealed the faint red marks Julian had left on his neck. A hypocrite, Julian thought, a complete animal. As soon as the briefing ended, Ethan cornered him. His voice was hesitant, almost vulnerable. He asked if the person with him last night was Julian. Julian, realizing Ethan didn't remember, decided to play dumb. He raised an eyebrow and asked if Ethan had perhaps accosted some poor young lady who had wisely fled. Annoyed, Ethan reached out and pulled open the collar of Julian's shirt, revealing the cluster of faint bruises on his collarbone. Ethan's eyes darkened with a mixture of confirmation and relief. He grabbed Julian's lapels, demanding to know why he wouldn't admit it. Julian looked away. It wasn't exactly a proud moment for either of them. He told Ethan to be clear. Ethan had initiated it, and Julian would take no responsibility. He saw Ethan's face darken further, and quickly added that he wouldn't tell Ethan's fiancée either. They could just pretend it never happened. After all, it was Julian's first time with a man too, but he couldn't help feeling that a man of Ethan's stature being taken advantage of was somehow the greater loss. Suddenly, Ethan began unbuttoning his own suit jacket. Julian's eyes widened in alarm. Was he going to strip right here in a government building? But Ethan only reached inside his shirt and unfastened a thin silver chain from around his neck. On it hung a single custom-made cufflink, shaped like a stylized star. It looked out of place against his pale skin. Julian was stunned, blurting out that Ethan had stolen his cufflink. Ethan's voice was strained as he corrected him. It was his. Julian looked closer and saw that it was indeed different from his own family's falcon crest. This one was a star, but the metal and craftsmanship were identical, as if they were companion pieces. Ethan finally seemed to regain his composure. He explained that before he was born, his mother had arranged a match for him, with a pair of custom cufflinks as the symbol of their union. He had never imagined the other party would be a man. He stated that since their pretense had become real, and they both had something to gain, they should make their arrangement official. Julian processed this for a moment, cutting to the chase. So, he still wanted Julian to take responsibility. Seeing Ethan's silent confirmation, a suspicion bloomed in Julian's mind. He asked him directly, "Did Ethan have feelings for him?" Ethan's lashes fluttered. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I do." Julian was floored by the simple, direct confession. He, who had navigated countless flirtations and affairs without a single entanglement, was suddenly at a loss for words. As Ethan moved closer, Julian could feel his own heart racing. Just as he was struggling to respond, an aide rushed in with urgent news. General Thorne and his wife had landed and were just outside the city. Julian snapped back to reality, pushing Ethan away. His parents were back. Ethan grabbed his arm, his voice tight. He asked if his parents meant a great deal to him. The question was strange, but Julian answered without hesitation. Of course. They were the best people in the world. Leaving Ethan, his mind in a turmoil, Julian ran into Amelia in the hallway. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her scarf. She asked if he had happened to drink the special plum liqueur she had prepared for him at the dinner. A cold realization washed over Julian as he fiddled with the signet ring in his pocket. He asked her if she had been hoping he would drink it. Amelia's eyes darted around frantically as she denied it. Julian gave her a thin, humorless smile. He advised her that while sweet drinks were pleasant, they could be harmful in excess. He decided to meet his parents at the private airfield himself. It had been over a decade since he'd seen his father. He planned to surprise him. From a distance, he saw the military convoy and the distinguished, graying man at its head. His father. He raised a hand, about to call out, when chaos erupted. An arrow, or rather a high-velocity dart, materialized from the trees and struck his father in the chest. His father swayed on his horse, looked down at the projectile in disbelief, and then collapsed, a spray of blood on his lips. In that same horrifying moment, Julian saw the man who had fired the shot. He was dressed in a stark white coat, a style so distinctive and cold. As that man saw Julian, a look of pure panic flashed in his eyes. His father fell to the ground, his dying gaze sweeping over Julian's hiding spot with cold unfamiliarity. He didn't recognize his own son. The convoy descended into chaos. Then, another sound, the roar of engines. A squadron of black-clad federal agents on tactical vehicles swarmed the scene. A voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "By order of the President, General Thorne has been neutralized for acts of treason. All accomplices who surrender will be spared." Julian's blood ran cold. His gaze found Ethan, and his world turned to ash. Ethan's lips moved, but no sound came out. He mouthed two words, "Run." Now, Julian stumbled back to his penthouse in a daze. An assistant, unaware of the tragedy, commented cheerfully that he must be excited for his parents' return. Julian wordlessly removed his signet ring and gave it to his most trusted security chief, a man loyal to his father. He gave him one instruction: Deliver this to Amelia's private residence." Not even an hour later, a formal summons arrived from the White House. The president requested his presence at an emergency dinner. He arrived dressed in his finest suit and sat in silence. The president, noticing his quietness, asked with feigned concern if he was feeling unwell. Julian's mouth was dry. He now understood that grief could be so profound it left no room for tears. He tried to eat, but the food was tasteless ash in his mouth. A soldier, covered in blood, burst into the room, shouting that General Thorne's loyalists were mounting a counterattack. The room exploded into chaos. "Protect the president." The blades of the Secret Service agents were suddenly all pointed at him, the traitor's son. Surrounded, Julian slowly rose to his feet. He walked to the center of the room and knelt. He declared that he was raised in the Capitol, under the president's guidance, and would never side with traitors. To prove his loyalty, he offered to take his own life in front of both armies. As he touched his forehead to the cold floor, the tears finally came, falling silently onto the marble, vanishing like a life crushed under the heel of power. The so-called rebellion was swiftly crushed. General Thorne was dead. His wife reported to have taken her own life in grief. And Julian, the son of a traitor, was thrown into a black site prison. The president decreed that while his life would be spared, he would face justice. He was sentenced to a disciplinary hearing, which meant a brutal, off-the-books beating, to be overseen by the vice president's ambitious son and Ethan Cole. The vice president's son descended the steps, a blade in his hand. He drew it across Julian's left arm, severing the tendons. The pain was excruciating, but Julian clenched his jaw and made no sound. The man chuckled, remarking on his toughness. Ethan stood silently, his hand gripping the hilt of his sidearm so tightly his knuckles were white. The man tossed the blade aside. The president's orders were that if Julian died, he died. He instructed the guards not to hold back. They understood. This was their chance to eliminate a potential future threat. The blows rained down. Pain gave way to a dull, throbbing numbness. His mouth filled with the taste of blood. The world blurred. Each time he neared unconsciousness, a bucket of icy water brought him back. He lost track of the count. Then, through the haze, he heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. An official carrying a presidential order rushed in. The order, read aloud, stated that in light of Julian's youth and non-involvement, and as he was the last of his mother's line, he was pardoned. He was to be married to Amelia, a sign of the president's magnanimity. The vice president's son showed no reaction, simply letting the guards continue. Another blow landed, and a guttural cry of pain was finally forced from Julian's lips. Ethan's voice, raw and strained, cut through the air. Enough. The vice president's son ignored him, telling the guards to continue. The official who brought the pardon nervously advised them to stop. He pointed out that Amelia would not be pleased to marry a cripple. With a sigh of theatrical regret, the man finally waved them off. The guards stepped back. Ethan moved to Julian's side, reaching out to help him up. Julian lunged forward and bit down hard on his forearm. Blood seeped through the white fabric of Ethan's shirt. Ethan winced but didn't pull away, letting Julian vent his rage. The vice president's son laughed. He mocked Ethan, saying his pet was ungrateful. He then sneered, revealing that the sniper Ethan had taken out was one of his own men, and this unauthorized action had cost Ethan his promotion and nearly his career. He called him a fool for gambling his future on a hopeless cause. Julian's jaw slackened. The dart that killed his father. It wasn't from Ethan. Ethan had been aiming at the other shooter, the one who was truly a threat. He released his grip and stumbled away. Ethan caught his uninjured hand. "Don't go." Julian finally looked at him, his voice a broken whisper. You knew all along. You're a liar just like them." Ethan's face was etched with pain. He could only plead, "Don't go with them." Julian pulled his hand away. "Ethan, the power I need now. You can't give it to me." A man of principle, a man bound by the law, could do nothing in a world where power was the only truth. He walked past Ethan, leaving him standing there, his shoulders slumped in defeat. An armored car from Amelia's detail was waiting outside. In the years that followed, Julian's wounds healed, but the doctors confirmed he would never have the same strength in his arm again. He learned from Amelia that the clean politician Ethan had once been was gone. He was now taking bribes, building alliances, playing the dirty game of politics. Julian felt nothing but a bitter emptiness. The wedding date was set. On the eve of the ceremony, he slipped away to a high-end, underground club. A beautiful performer cozied up to him, whispering in his ear. As she leaned in, Julian saw him. Ethan. His eyes were like chips of ice. He told Julian to come with him. Julian laughed coldly, telling him he had no authority here. A performer nestled closer to Julian, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Ethan repeated his command. Julian, feeling cruel, pointed to a glass of straight whiskey on the table. He told Ethan that if he drank it, he would go. He knew Ethan never touched hard liquor. Without a word, Ethan seized the glass and downed it in one go, the liquid spilling down his chin and staining his shirt. He looked at Julian, his eyes dark and intense. "Is that enough?" Julian gestured for the performer to leave. When they were alone, he stood and leaned close to Ethan, whispering in his ear. "As you wish." Ethan grabbed him and pulled him towards the exit. They were stopped at the door by Amelia's men. Julian leaned against the wall, a smirk on his face, telling Ethan it seemed he was out of luck. Ethan ignored him. He looked at the man blocking their path as if he were already dead. He stated that he was taking Julian, and that was final. The man warned him, hinting at the powerful people he worked for. Before he could finish his sentence, a blade flashed, and the man crumpled to the floor. The other guards froze. In the stunned silence, Ethan took Julian's hand and led him to his car. Back at Ethan's penthouse, the alcohol was clearly hitting him. He looked at Julian, his voice trembling slightly. He asked if he was truly going to marry her. Julian, his own mind hazy, gave a hollow yes. Ethan's hand came up to cup his jaw, his eyes burning with a possessive fire that broke through his control. He asked if anyone with a pretty face could have Julian. Julian, wanting to hurt him, leaned in and whispered that of course they could. If Ethan could give him the power a marriage to Amelia offered, he would marry him instead. Ethan didn't speak. He simply pulled Julian into a desperate, crushing kiss. It was not driven by drugs or confusion. This was raw, unadulterated need. As they kissed, Julian's hand deftly slipped into Ethan's coat, removing the security keycard that would grant him access to the federal building's secure levels. Ethan flinched, his body going still. Julian felt a wave of sour despair wash off him, extinguishing the last of his reason. He deepened the kiss, a calculated move to distract, to take what he needed. It was a kiss born of strategy, of a dark and uncertain future. But as Ethan responded with a bruising intensity of his own, something shifted. The two matching pieces of jewelry, one a star, one a falcon, lay side by side on a nearby table, gleaming in the moonlight, just as they were always meant to be. Later that night, with Ethan asleep beside him, Julian carefully dressed. He stole a car from the garage and drove out of the city, never looking back. In the 15th year of the Thorne era, news broke that Julian Thorne, the disgraced heir, had been killed after his vehicle plunged off a cliff during a high-speed chase. 1 year later, Julian re-emerged in the southwest, having claimed his father's hidden assets and private military forces, openly declaring war on the federal government. That same year, Ethan Cole took 3 bullets for the president, an act of loyalty that saw him restored to his former power. The next year, the vice president's son was exiled for a failed coup. By the 20th year, Julian's forces, the Southland Army, were unstoppable, splitting the country in two. And by the 22nd year, Ethan Cole, now holding unprecedented power over 3 federal agencies, was known in the shadows as the Demon of D.C. 8 years after he vanished, the sun set over Julian's sprawling desert compound. He rode in from the plains on horseback, a rabbit for his niece's dinner slung over his shoulder, a fresh cut on his arm. His second-in-command, a man named Marcus, greeted him. He mentioned that Julian's niece, Talia, had been asking for rabbit stew just yesterday. Julian tossed him the rabbit, reminding him to have the cooks be thorough, as a child's stomach was delicate. Inside his command tent, Marcus informed him that an envoy from the government was waiting outside, likely to negotiate. Julian, looking over strategic maps, said he had nothing to discuss with them and told Marcus to send him away. As he spoke, a sleek, black dart shot through the tent flap and embedded itself in the wooden table beside him. The craftsmanship was impeccable, the power behind it immense. Julian pulled it free and saw the single, stylized letter engraved at its base, E. All of Ethan's personal equipment was marked with it. The man outside was Ethan Cole. Marcus, not recognizing the mark, began to laugh about the pathetic attempts people made to get Julian's attention. Julian looked at him, one eyebrow raised. Is something funny? Marcus's smile vanished. Julian sighed and told him to let the man in. The tent flap opened, and there stood Ethan, outlined by the dawn. 8 years had made him sharper, more formidable, but the stark, dark suit remained the same. Julian gestured for him to sit. Ethan's dark eyes were unreadable, but Julian could feel the storm of emotion churning beneath the surface, a raw force barely contained. He chose to ignore it. After a long silence, Ethan spoke. Julian, withdraw your troops. Julian laughed, a low, dangerous sound. He asked what possible leverage Ethan thought he had. Did he believe their shared history was enough to make him abandon his quest for vengeance? Ethan's gaze faltered slightly. He calmly laid out the tactical situation. D.C.'s elite guard, the Northern armies loyal to the establishment moving to flank him. Southland would be crushed. Julian was unimpressed. So that was Ethan's point. Ethan stood and, taking a knife from Julian's belt, drew a line across the tactical map. He proposed they divide the nation. Julian scoffed at the idea of sharing power with the corrupt establishment. Not with them, Ethan corrected, his eyes fixed on Julian. With me. The rumors were true. Ethan's power in D.C. was absolute, rivaling that of the president himself. Julian toyed with a map marker. And what if he preferred mutual destruction? Ethan's expression was impossible to read. He told Julian that treason and regicide were sins that would stain his soul forever. Julian replied coolly that he didn't care. But I do, Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly. He quickly regained his composure. And so do you. You would sacrifice the men who have followed you, who have bled for you. Julian fell silent. He finally conceded that Ethan was as manipulative as ever, fully deserving of his demonic reputation. At the mention of the name, Ethan flinched. Julian smiled without warmth. asking why he was still here. Was he expecting an invitation to dinner? He purred that Ethan shouldn't get too comfortable in an enemy camp. After all, Julian was not known for his gentlemanly conduct. In a flash, Ethan leaned across the table and captured his lips. The kiss was brief, desperate, and searing. "Julian, I've missed you." Julian leaned back, recovering his composure. He asked if this was Ethan's attempt at seducing him. He pointed out that he could have anyone he wanted with a snap of his fingers, a fact Ethan knew all too well from their days in the city. Ethan moved around the table and pinned him against it, his eyes red-rimmed. "Brother," he whispered, using an old, intimate nickname from their youth, "don't choose them. Choose me." He kissed him again, deeper this time. Julian remained cold, asking if this was supposed to be his seduction. Just as Ethan's hands began to unfasten his shirt, a small, timid voice came from the entrance of the tent. "Daddy?" Ethan froze. A little girl with Julian's eyes peeked into the tent. Julian pushed Ethan off and scooped the girl, Talia, into his arms. He asked her why she was up so early. She whispered that it was dark and she was scared. After he had soothed her back to sleep, he realized Ethan was gone. Later, he found Ethan sitting under a lone desert tree. Talia was with him. She was asking him if he was in love with her daddy. Ethan, awkward around the child, just grunted in affirmation. He then asked, hesitantly, if she was Julian's real daughter. Talia tilted her head. "Of course not. I'm a little peach. Daddy picked me from a tree." The flicker of a smile on Ethan's face died instantly. Julian couldn't help but laugh at the sight of the great Ethan Cole being outsmarted by a 6-year-old. He called to Talia, and she ran into his arms. He explained to Ethan that Talia was his late sister's daughter. After the fall of his family, he was all she had left. He gave her his name so no one would dare harm her. Ethan's eyes fell. "So you did it on purpose," he said, his voice low. "To make me jealous. To manipulate me. Just like 8 years ago." He asked what Julian wanted from him this time. Julian simply looked at him, his expression unreadable. He told Talia to go play. When she was gone, he leaned against the tree, the picture of lazy arrogance. "If I want it, will you give it?" Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting Julian's. "Yes. Anything you want, I will give you." Julian's lips curved into the same flirtatious smile he had worn years ago. "Then what if I said, 'I want you'?" In that moment, as they stared at each other, the fate of a nation was sealed. The world would see it as a masterful political gambit, with Julian luring his rival into a trap. But they wouldn't see that in the intricate game of lies and truths, Julian himself had lost his way, his own heart caught in the ripples he had created. 3 days later, the gates of Washington, D.C. swung open. A column of soldiers marched out, forming 2 lines. Ethan emerged from the city, dressed in a white shirt stained with blood. In his hands, held aloft, was the presidential seal, untouched by the carnage. He walked straight to where Julian sat on his horse and knelt, bowing his head in a gesture of perfect formal submission. "On behalf of the transitional government, I, Ethan Cole, welcome the new president." Julian looked down at the symbol of absolute power resting in Ethan's hands. He reached for it, then paused. "Is something missing?" he asked. Ethan looked up, his eyes deep and intense. "The seal of the first spouse. I'm keeping that for myself." A slow smile spread across Julian's face. He dismounted and walked past Ethan into the city, with Ethan rising and falling into step right behind him. He sat on the cold, ornate chair in the Oval Office, a place he never wanted. The former president, his uncle, scrambled out from a darkened corner and clung to his leg, the symbol of his office rolling across the floor. He begged for his life, pleading their family connection. Julian knelt and pried the old man's fingers from his pants, one by one. "Uncle," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "my parents were your family, too." He stood and gave a quiet order. "Take him away. Feed him to the dogs." When it was over, there was no elation, only a vast, hollow ache. He looked at his hands, which had orchestrated a revolution without ever firing a shot, yet felt irrevocably stained with blood. "Ethan," he whispered, "I'm a monster. There will be a reckoning for this." Ethan stepped to his side and took his hand. "My president will live a long and prosperous life, because I will always be here." On the night of his inauguration, after a day of pomp and ceremony, Julian returned to his private quarters to find Ethan waiting for him. He eyed him warily. "You're still here?" Ethan's expression was calm. "I'm here to attend to the president." Julian quickly refastened the belt he had just undone. "Are you insane? I have to be up for briefings at dawn." Ethan moved towards him, his hands going to Julian's robes. "The night is long. Perhaps you could start by explaining to me how, with me clearing every obstacle from the inside, it still took you 3 months to take a single city." Julian's ears burned. He couldn't admit he was terrified it was a trap, that he had been so cautious because he couldn't bear the thought of losing. He had nothing left to lose. He opened his eyes and met Ethan's gaze, now smoldering with desire. With a sigh of resignation, he gave in. After that night, Julian learned just how terrifying a man starved for 8 years could be. He considered it a victory if he could walk to his morning meetings. He was the most powerful man in the world, yet he found himself dreading the sound of Ethan's name. One day, he was reviewing a document when Ethan entered with a pile of blankets. "Your Majesty, I've come to attend to you." Julian ignored him, turning to his chief of staff. "Did I request any company tonight?" The old man smiled nervously and beat a hasty retreat, saying he wouldn't meddle in the affairs of the president and the first gentleman. Seeing him leave, Ethan's smile widened. He pressed Julian back against his desk. "Does it matter who attends to you? As long as your Majesty is satisfied." Years later, Julian sought out Dr. Finch. He asked the analyst to predict what challenges lay ahead for him and Ethan. Dr. Finch, after a great deal of theatrical calculation, assured him their future would be peaceful. Julian didn't believe him. The man always spoke in riddles. Dr. Finch sighed and suggested that instead of worrying about the future, Julian might want to check on Ethan at his family home, as his current prediction's accuracy was time-sensitive. When Julian arrived at the Cole family estate, he found the staff silent and tense. He was directed to the family chapel. The sharp crack of a rod against flesh stopped him at the door. Ethan's father, a man of rigid principles, was berating his son. He accused him of disgracing their family's legacy of integrity, of tying their name to a bloody coup, all for the sake of a boy he claimed to be manipulating. A heavy cane landed on Ethan's back again and again. His white shirt was soaked in blood, but he knelt without making a sound. The old man finally threw the cane down, stumbling back, muttering about the traitor he had raised. Julian rushed forward, trying to cover Ethan's bleeding back, but the blood was everywhere. Ethan's father sneered at him, showing no deference to his title. Before Julian could retort, Ethan stopped him. He looked at his father, his face pale but his voice steady. He asked if his father was angry that he had helped overthrow a tyrant, or angry that he had handed the power he could have claimed for himself to another. The old man, speechless at being challenged by his own son, choked and stumbled out of the room. They visited the graves of Julian's parents together. The sight was immaculate. Ethan told him he had come every year to tell them that their son was safe, that they shouldn't worry. Julian leaned against him, the familiar, clean scent of Ethan's cologne a comforting anchor. It was a beautiful spring day, much like the one years ago when a brilliant, laughing boy had tossed a signet ring from a balcony. Ethan, catch! Down below, a serious young man in a dark suit had pushed through the crowd and caught the ring in his hand. Caught it. He had looked at the ring in his palm, a small, unconscious smile gracing his lips for the first time that day. I caught you, my president. Julian never had children of his own. When he died, he was buried beside Ethan. Talia, whom he had raised as his own, succeeded him, becoming the nation's first female president. She later fell in love with a female general who had disguised herself as a man, a story that became a legend in its own right. But that was a tale for another time. The unofficial histories would record that Emperor Julian and his consort, the Demon of D.C., were a treacherous pair who stole a nation. For 40 years, the emperor ruled, but the true power lay with his consort. The emperor, known in his youth for his wild ways, never took another lover, remaining exclusively devoted to one man. In the 40th year of his reign, his consort died of illness. The emperor followed him a week later.